Today is August 5th, 1995. I'm speaking with Maurine Ratliff and her brother Bob Conklin at Maurine's home in Corvallis, Oregon. We're talking about their experiences with the transportable logging railroad communities of Shevlin-Hixon Logging and Lumber Company of Bend, Oregon. This is tape number 10 of the Shevlin-Hixon Oral History Project. My name is Ron Gregory, and the tape belongs to me. I'd like to begin this interview by asking when and where you were born, and perhaps we can start with you, Maurine.
I was born in Bend at the only one of the four children born at home at our house at 348 State Street in Bend. And I'm the second of four children, older brother Jim, and then myself, and then the twins, Bob and Ruth.
And what year was that?
I was born in 1923. And that house was a one-owner home until, well, it's still in the family because it belongs to my sister now. So it was built in 1919 and still in the family.
How about you, Bob?
I was born in Bend at St. Charles Hospital, June 6, 1927. I was one of the twins. My twin sister was Ruth Costa.
Okay. And when and why did your family decide to work for the Shevlin-Hixon Company?
Well, Dad was a teacher in Minnesota, and he didn't like teaching very well, and he was quite a mathematician, and he started working for Shevlin-Hixon. He quit his teaching job and started working for Shevlin-Hixon in Minnesota. And then when Shevlin bought holdings in Oregon, they sent, and I think this was about 1916, they sent him west to Oregon to cruise and survey and look over the holdings that they had purchased in Oregon.
Okay. And, okay, you mentioned that your father was a logging engineer for the Shevlin-Hixon Company. What exactly are the responsibilities of a logging engineer?
Well, his primary responsibility originally was to lay out the railroads, because back in the early days, and then all the logging in Central Oregon was done by railroad, and then more and more developed into truck logging. But he was laid out the railroads and surveyed the railroads and the logging roads, and did timber cruising, surveying, and that type of thing for the Shevlin-Hixon Company. Primarily, he was in charge of all the logging engineering aspects out in the woods area.
I remember one year they had a logging project where they built a flume in and flumed the logs down to the Deschutes River and then floated them down to the mill. And that was quite a sight to see.
Yeah, I have a newspaper article on that from the Bend Bulletin.
Oh, yeah.
That shows the big log drive down the Deschutes River. Seems like it was in the 30s.
Yeah, it would have been in the 30s, because I can remember those logs coming down that flume and that water, and I was pretty little then, but it really scared me.
I remember a log jam on one of the bridges, too. It backed up, must have been half to 3/4 of a mile. And then I was standing on the bridge for half the morning watching them free those logs and get them moving down the river again.
Well, it sounds then that logging engineer was something of a combination forester, surveyor, cruiser mapper, road locator, and builder, cost estimator, and so on and so forth.
And a city planner.
And a city planner, yeah.
But at that time, the word wasn't really defined what a city planner was. But he was a city planner because, in addition to all his other chores, he was in charge of laying out the town sites for all the towns of Shevlin.
So he was no ordinary laborer. He was a very skilled individual.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, and he was primarily self-taught.
Okay. So You had mentioned, Maurine, that he had been a teacher back in Minnesota. And so he went to work for the Shevlin-Hixon company. Did he start out as the logging engineer?
No. He was.
Actually, he started out as a cook or a dishwasher and worked his way up into it by correspondence courses and studies, and he worked himself into the position of logging engineer.
He studied. Of course, there were a lot of long, lonely evenings, and he got ICS courses, International Correspondence courses in engineering. And he spent his evenings for years studying. And it was in the 30s then, and he went to Portland to take his professional engineer's exam. And I can remember Mother saying how scared he was of it and uptight and everything. And he didn't want to go back for the afternoon session. She made him go back for it. Or it's a 2-day test then, I guess. But by golly, he passed it the first time.
Well, was this to be licensed by
this
the State
is a
Board of Engineers?
registered professional logging engineer.
Okay.
It's kind of interesting that 100% of the male members of the George Conklin family are registered professional engineers.
Is that right?
My father, George, was a registered logging engineer. My older brother, Jim, was a registered electrical engineer, and I'm a registered civil engineer.
Okay. And as such as being registered, that means that you're licensed by a particular state? Is that what that is?
Yes, that means you're licensed to practice that area and discipline of engineering.
Okay. Well, do you recall any stories that your father brought home about what camp life was like with the Shevlin-Hixon company?
He didn't really talk a great deal about it, but then I worked for him for about 3 or 4 summers, and then we went out to the camp quite often. Not real often, I'd say every month or two, maybe during the school year. But then I worked for him for I think it was 4 summers as compassman, chainman, and that type of thing.
Bob, of course, was younger, and my older brother Jim and I used to go out with Dad because my mom was pretty busy with those twins. And Jim and I would go out and stay at his cabin at Lapine or at Shevlin during the day while he'd go out working. And we were out there with him a number of times, and so we got in quite a bit of camp life then. And one thing I remember was the old cookhouse, and where the bachelor loggers would eat and everything, and Dad would take us in there sometimes, and those cookies were must have been about 10 or 12 inches in diameter and an inch thick. They were a meal in itself almost.
And the bachelors like those, I think.
Oh, yes, yes.
Well, one characteristic about the cookhouse is had some semblance of a company store. They really fed them good. Big breakfasts, and then they packed lunches out of this world, and then big suppers, and boy, did those people eat. And they always lost money. They charged everybody so much for a meal, but the company lost money because they used the philosophy, well, then a full stomach means a happy employee.
Right. Well, were family members, did they eat there also?
Very seldom. Most family members, then they had their own homes, and then the wife would cook the meals. It was primarily the bachelors that ate at the dining hall.
What was the ratio of, say, bachelors to family men there? Were there quite a few, or not as many bachelors as family men?
Well, there were, I would say probably there were lots more families than there were bachelors.
Why do you suppose that was?
I don't know.
But I remember during the war, then a lot of the bachelors, they came up from Oklahoma, Arkansas, and that kind of places. especially during the war when manpower was short, and then a lot of the bachelors came up from that particular area.
Yeah, Clint had also mentioned, that that the Okies and the Arkies came up.
Right.
He had mentioned something about there being some difficulties with those particular folks, that they didn't seem to quite fit in there for some reason. It was a close knit.
There was, you heard the term Okies and Arkies quite a bit, and some of them were uneducated, and I remember the mechanic was cussing out one of the Okies or Arkies one time. He just overhauled the engine of a truck, and he was supposed to drive it to camp, and the mechanic said, "Well, I just overhauled this, so drive slow." And the next day within that arc, he came back and he told the mechanic, "Well, I drove slow, all right. I had it in compound low all the way." That mechanic was fit to be tied. He said, that truck was never damn good after that.
Yeah, that must have made for a long day driving in compound low.
Yeah, right. He says, I drove it real slow, compound low all the way.
Well, were these folks, the Okies and the Arkies, did they work in the woods, or were they? Yeah,
they did. They were timber fallers, filter setters, truck drivers, and all that kind of.
But that was just during one period there.
That was probably about the middle 40s, and where most of the so-called Okies and Arkies came to Shevlin.
And did they hang around long, or did they tend to move on shortly afterwards?
Well, I think they hung on. I don't know if there was any real large percentage turnover. I would guess that it was comparable to other types of operations.
Well, also a lot of the young men that were working there went into the armed forces, and so they needed manpower. I know Herb Maker was my dad's compass man in transit, and he had to go into the army, and it was real interesting because Dad liked Herb just very much, and so he gave me his address, and he said, "I want you to write to Herb." He's having quite a time, so I corresponded with Herb Maker, started when he's overseas, starting in Italy, and he wrote the most interesting letters. All the way through the campaign, U.S. Army campaign in Europe, and we did correspond the whole time, and it was interesting. Herbie was Lois's brother,
Yeah, right.
So that was kind of an interesting thing, and Dad was just real happy to have me because he didn't want her to get lonely.
Right. Probably wanted to come back after the war.
Yeah, that's right. So. But Herb found himself a beautiful wife overseas.
My uncle did the same thing in Italy. Yeah. Well, tell me more about the cookhouse then. For example, how large it was or where it was located.
Oh, it was a railroad car.
Yeah.
It was the length of like a caboose, or a large one, a railroad car, and it stayed on wheels. It stayed on the wheels.
I think they actually showed. One of these types of cars, one of them was a cookhouse, and then the dining room was connected to that. And
with another railroad car.
Where was it located in respect to the rest of the community?
Oh, it was near the office.
It was in the downtown area where the railroad tracks were, where the office, the grocery store, the beer tavern, and those types of things which remained on the rails, but then and the bunkhouses, but then it was in the downtown Shevlin area.
Did you get anything about Bill Bear in your interviews or anything?
Go ahead.
He was the bookkeeper, the financial man, and then he and his wife Alice Bear they lived out at Shevlin, and we used to go visit them. Bill and Alice Bear were good friends of my mom and dad, and we used to spend time with them out at Shevlin. But I remember their house was a little bit different because theirs was several railroad cars in a row, long, narrow. And I remember one time when we were visiting there, I happened to open the refrigerator, and it was some ammonia cooled or something. Anyway, I got a whiff of that ammonia, and it was a very scary experience for me. But the Bears, and they had, let's see, there was Bill, and then Kathy, and what was the oldest? Goppy was the oldest one. Yeah. And then Catherine and Bill, and when they lived out there, then when they moved into Bend, when they had more children. I remember their daughter Catherine had a real bad experience. She accidentally swallowed a bottle or part of a bottle of Lysol. And I just happened to be going to the theater in Bend with the neighbors, and I saw Alice Bear carrying in the baby, and she had her Catherine. She must have been a year and a half, 2 years old, and so I called my mom, and she got in touch with us, but that's what had happened. And the baby lived through that, everything, but then they were back in Minnesota visiting relatives one summer, and she contacted measles and whooping cough together, and the little girl died, which was a sad thing, because they were prominent members of Shevlin, and so they came back without their little girl.
Get back to your original question about the mess hall. I remember I ate at the mess hall, my dad and I, during the week when I worked for my dad, and as I said, those people could really eat. Well, there was hard work out there in the woods, because that was before chainsaws were very popular, and those timber fellers used a crosscut saw, and those guys worked hard along with everybody else. And they would line up at the cookhouse door on the porch of the cookhouse, or at the mess hall, for supper. I think supper was about 4:30, maybe 5 o'clock, something like that, and then they'd open the doors, and then they would rush in and sit down, and boy, would they shovel that food away.
What was the atmosphere like in there at mealtime? Was it loud, boisterous?
Pass the meat, pass the potatoes, pass the gravy, that type of thing. And
so it wasn't a quiet type of atmosphere.
No, it wasn't quiet.
They started their day.
Table manners was not very sophisticated. There was a lot of border house reaches and that kind of stuff, but and they would shovel that food away like mad.
But they had their breakfast before dawn in the morning, and they started their days real early. I can remember one time when the cook's helper accidentally stuck his arm into a vat of hot grease when they were cooking donuts, because they did all their own baking. Yeah. And the main cook grabbed the kid and had him put his arm down in the flour bin and hold it there for an hour or so. And apparently it pulled it out right away, pulled the heat out and the oil out. And the boy was never had bad burns on that arm.
How about that?
Which, it was quite a thing that happened. The boy owes his life to that, or his arm to that cook who just had him stick his arm in that.
Well, you mentioned prodigious amounts of food. How did they store this food? Where did they store it? Let me ask you that.
Well, I think it was primarily ice houses, or I think it was ice houses where they
used to go out and cut the ice in the wintertime and store it in the ice houses, and those were big had insulated walls with sawdust And I remember the huge doors, and they had ice houses.
This was in the earlier days, so probably before an electrical plant.
In the 20s and 30s. Well, even then, if they had electricity was not a dependable thing in those days. They would they might have a generator going for some hours or something, but it wasn't. It wasn't until the 40s that rural electrification really brought wires.
Well, most of they had electricity in later camps, but they were big diesel electric generators. And
they had these at the Lapine camp, for instance. Don't you recall?
Yeah, right.
What about Cliff Camp?
Which one did you call that?
Cliff Camp, from my understanding, was probably the one before the Lapine Camp.
That's the one where...
Okay, that's the one near Lava Butte.
No, there were two near Lava Butte, because there was one on the flats at Lava Butte, and then one beyond Lava Butte that was Cliff Camp, I guess.
But that was in the 20s, I believe.
Oh yeah, the one at Lava Butte was in the 20s and 30s, and then there was another one that was. I know we went flat and then went up a hill, and that was during the 30s. And I remember Dad taking us out there in the wintertime and a sledding. There was a big sled hill right near the road, and we would sled down that hill. And there was always lots of snow out there in the wintertime. But that's where it was usually kerosene lamps and that type, and they did have maybe some generators for an occasional
that's right.
electricity.
Yeah, most of it was kerosene lights. It was the downtown area where they had electricity for the office cookouts.
Right. Okay.
And the ice houses were just the sawdust behind wood walls and things, and they would cut the ice through the winter, and then that would last pretty much through the summer. For
I don't remember any of that.
Yeah.
That must have been before my time. First one I remember, I was only about 3 or 4 years old, was moving out of the Shevlin camp, and they moved to the one at Finley Butte, just east of Lapine.
Right.
And that's my first recollection. And then from that camp, they moved to the Summit Station camp on the Fremont Highway. And then from that camp, they moved to what they call the Timbers Camp, which is the one east of Chemult.
Well, my understanding now, and perhaps I'm wrong on this, but my understanding was that Chemult, or what others have called the Chemult camp, was there, just southeast of the community of Chemult. And then after Shevlin-Hixon sold to Brooks Scanlon, they moved the town up north a little bit, but south of Gilcrest, and that was called the Timbers Camp. And maybe
no, the Timbers Camp was the one that was southeast of Chemult, and that was kind of the final Shevlin-Hixon camp. Because I remember specifically my dad, they referred to that as a Timbers Camp, and that's just a picture of it right down here in this newspaper.
My first recollection of the camp was the one on the flats near Lava Butte, and that's where my Uncle Sid Conklin, and Martha first lived. And this is a picture of them, and with one of the camp cabins there in the background, and that's when they were first married.
And what time would this be?
And I was born in 23, and it must have been about 26, because I was about probably 3 to 4 years old. And you could ask Frank for a more exact time when his parents were married. But the thing I remember was driving down old Highway 97, and the first thing you would see when we would keep watching for it, Jim and I would watch for it, was my aunt and uncle's clothesline. because that was the first thing you could see, knowing that you were getting in near camp. And we'd go out and visit them at the Lapine camp, and that was in the 20s, I'm sure.
Okay. I'll ask you, what the housing was like, for example. How were these houses transported? What was unique about it that allowed that?
Well, one thing that I remember quite unique about them is they had two big beams under each building. I think they're probably about 10, 12 feet wide. And the big beams are actually skids. And with a hook, so when they're going to move those homes, so then the cat comes up and hooks onto them and pulls them away. And there were some of the larger families, but then they had two buildings, and they built a kind of a temporary connection in between the two buildings. One was maybe a building with a dining room, kitchen, living room area, and the others was maybe bedroom. And they had kind of a little breezeway type connecting them, and then when they're going to move them to the next town site, well, then they dismantle that breezeway. And I also remember the awning over the porch, which would fold down over the windows and doors. And
large families would have 2 to 3 of those houses, convert some to bedroom units. Mm-hmm. And then they make kind of a covered walkway between them for living. Mm-hmm. And of course there was never any indoor plumbing. They all had their own outhouse.
Okay. But all the time, or did that change over time?
No,
every one of them, they all had their own outhouse.
Okay.
Yeah.
No indoor plumbing then?
Well, there was a sink. Mm-hmm. And a drain, but that pumps, and I think the kitchen sinks are drained out.
Yeah, but they didn't have any toilets.
No.
Inside.
Not at Finley Butte or at Chemult?
No, never.
No, they're all pit toilets out there.
And some families would have a gasoline-powered washing machine, but they never had electrical washing machines. But I remember they were gasoline-powered, and of course the scrub brushes and the clotheslines were the dryer, and because over in Eastern Oregon you could dry anything. In the wintertime they would freeze dry, mm-hmm. and in the summertime they would breeze dry.
Okay. Well, what about food storage for those folks? Where did they?
Ice boxes.
Ice boxes. Okay. What about cellars?
No cellars that I remember.
Benny and Florence had a root house.
Okay.
I remember it was dug under and timbers, and then they filled dirt over it, and they stored their potatoes and their vegetables and things there.
What about garbage? How did folks dispose of their garbage?
They had a garbage pit. It was only about a quarter or half a mile from Shevlin Camp, where they cleared an area, and bulldozer would dig down a good-sized pit, maybe 10, 15 feet deep, and they would dump their garbage in that area. I don't think they had any so-called garbage collection. I think it was up to the individual to dump the garbage there, and then when they moved the camp some years later, then they would just take the dirt where the pit was and cover over the garbage.
Okay. Did they ever burn any of the refuse in these pits or anything? Would they attract vermin or
Well, I think there's probably a few bears, but
coyotes.
Yeah, but I don't remember any.
There's no problem that
I don't think they did any burning of it.
Yeah, I was just wondering for sanitation purposes and whatnot.
It probably spread lime, I think, on it, but I just don't recall that.
Well, I remember a couple of the garbage pits at some of the later camps, and they were just off the road of maybe 100 yards, kind of behind some trees where it wasn't too noticeable.
Were they pretty good-sized pits? pretty good size. I mean, that's a lot of people out there in the woods.
It was, I would say maybe a couple 100 feet.
I think they would dig and fill it and then probably cover and then dig another hole and just continue.
Well, I don't think they were. Nowadays, they cover up every day. Well, they didn't in those days.
That would be every 6 months or so. Every summer, maybe. I don't know.
But these were located in a certain distance from the camp.
Yeah, right.
Okay. How did folks get their groceries and supplies out there?
They had a grocery store. It was one of those larger buildings on the rail, and that's where they would buy a lot of their groceries. Of course, they'd come into Bend quite frequently, too.
And into Lapine, when the camps that were out in the Lapine area, they go into Foss's store. Foss's store was the big, store in the area. And I can remember a great big rounds of Tillamook cheese they had there, and they cut them off and weigh them. And there was a Foss's store provided a lot for those camps.
Particularly the camp at Finley Butte, which is only about 4 or 5 miles from Lapine.
Right. Okay, but as far as like the cookhouse, where did those folks get their supplies? There must have been.
I think they were probably trucked from Bend.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the reason I ask is I've often heard rumors that Erickson, for example,
Erickson's Grocery
built their reputation on supplying the lumber camp.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Erickson, right. Erickson was a big store, yeah.
However, let's see, did they keep any animals out there for fresh meat, any pigs or anything like that you recall?
No.
I don't think
they did.
They'd have a hard time, because the winters were pretty severe, and they'd have a hard time keeping them. Because the men were off working, and they worked real hard and real tired, and I don't think that they, farmed or grazed anything.
Okay. How were the houses arranged in the camps? Was there a particular ordering, or did people just say, I want that spot over there?
That's what our dad did.
Well, I don't really remember. I remember my dad being a logging engineer. Of course, his home was used as half office and half living quarters, and he took a corner lot in the Timbers camp there, the one southeast of Chamal. But I don't know how they were assigned. I think maybe the camp manager got together with the people and then arranged it. The layout of the camp itself was pretty rectangular type of layout. They didn't have curving dirt road. Naturally, none of the roads were ever paved. But I remember the camp at Summit Station was very well laid out from the standpoint, the front doors, and most of them had lawns there. That was probably the most well-developed and nicest camp of any of them. They had lawns out there.
Lots of annual flowers.
And then they had a walkway right down the middle where the front lawns faced each other, and then the streets were in the back where the garages were and that kind of stuff. But the walkway was real nice and pleasant with all the green grass and flowers. And I still remember when I was just a kid there, after supper, these people would mosey down, and then they'd chat with a neighbor who was sitting out there in the front porch, and then mosey down a little bit more. And that type of thing is now considered very good urban planning, to get the street behind the buildings, behind the residential, and a lot of urban developments now have that. A lot of where all you have is the walkway, pedestrian activities in the front of the house, and the street in the back. But as I mentioned, then nobody knew what an urban planner was back in those days. But my dad wouldn't know, but he ended up to be what I consider a pretty good original urban planner in the way he developed and designed some of these town sites. And it was very pleasant and very nice and quiet after they have dinner, and it was pretty long days, but then they'd mosey down the street, or not down the street, down this walkway, and chat with the neighbors, because all the dusty roads were behind the building. And it was just very nice.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I can remember with Jim and I going out and staying with Dad. Dad lived out the Summit Stage Station there for a while, and apparently it's while he was planning the camp that would be there. But this was the old Summit Stage Station that for the Overland Stage, and this was the big station. And it was a huge log cabin. Jim and I would sleep upstairs. There was a loft up there, and there was a ladder up to the loft, and Jim and I would sleep up there, and Dad's office and living room and the great big potbelly stove was downstairs. And Jim and I spent time out there with Dad too. And another thing I remembered about that was it was an area where the deer would come in a lot, and Dad always put out salt licks for the deer, and there was a huge pile of antlers out there near the Summit Stage Station, and the front porch was decorated with some of those antlers, deer antlers too. But this must have been Shevlin wasn't out there yet, but this was when Dad was out there apparently planning for the Summit Stage Station camp. Yeah. But Jim and I spent quite a bit of time in the summer out there.
Well, you mentioned, the lawns and the flowers, and, that's a fairly dry area out there. Where were they getting their water supply when they were at that camp? Do you recall?
I think that must have been wells.
I think so too, because it was pumice ground, a real pumice type ground, and I remember taking the watering can. Jim and I taking the watering can and watering lawn and things.
Yeah, and of course it's not very far from the Fort Rock Valley either, which is, it's a fairly dry area, so wells would make sense.
But in those days, transportation wasn't the best, and Dad would go out. I know he'd get up about 4 o'clock on Monday morning and to go out there, and then he wouldn't come back in until Saturday, so he just usually spend Saturday evening and Sunday with us, and Monday morning he was gone again. And it took a long time to travel from like the Lapine or Shevlin area into Bend compared to what it is now.
You couldn't just take a train in, one of the logging railroad trains?
No, because that would go through the day and dump us logs and then come back. Right. Oh, speaking of trains, though, I remember Dad, for a treat, we'd get to ride the train back into camp sometimes in the engine. And, this...
I remember that, too. That was quite a thrill. Get out there, and I think he had it prearranged with the train engineer, and he'd go and flag it down, and he'd stop, and we'd climb aboard, and then ride it in, and the railroad beds were not real smooth. It bounced around quite a bit because they were just all temporary, but I remember tooting the whistle and all that kind of stuff.
And that was the horn. And
that was a real thrill.
And it was so horribly noisy in the cab. You couldn't talk to anybody.
Because they were steaming. Yeah. They were strictly steaming. And they used wood for the fire. And that was a real thrill.
This old engine at Avery Park here in Corvallis apparently was originally belonged to Shevlin-Hixon, and I'm not sure if it's the one we went on or not, but then it was sold to Brooks Scanlon, and Brooks Scanlon sold it to whoever's on the, I don't know if that's Georgia Pacific, I think.
Down at Toledo.
Yeah, but and then they donated it to the city. But that old engine there at Avery Park is one of the old logging engines. And Lee Allen, who grew up, he was the son of Judge Allen in Deschutes County, and he became a county agent here in Corvallis. And he was telling me that was the original Shevlin-Hixon train that sold to Brooks and then to Georgia Pacific.
How about that? Well, shifting here a little bit, numerous ethnic groups were employed by many of the timber companies in the Pacific Northwest. Chinese, Japanese, Scandinavians, Greeks, Italians, and others all worked in the timber industry in the Pacific Northwest. Do you remember any particular ethnic groups working for Shevlin-Hixon out in the
A lot of Scandinavians.
Yeah, a lot of Scandinavians. I don't remember any Orientals.
Any blacks or Hispanics?
No.
But there were
Germans, Norwegians,
Eastern Europeans, Czechoslovakians.
No, I don't think so.
remember.
The Czechs were up in Washington
Okay.
quite a bit.
And other than remarks about Okies and Arkies, so then there was no ethnic problem or anything like that I know of.
No individuals known as bohunks out in the camp?
Well, they
I think
assimilated everybody got along with everybody pretty well. There weren't any racial problems or anything that I can recall at all.
No, there weren't any.
In fact, when I got growing up in Bend and Lapine, that area, I got quite a shock when I went when I was a freshman at the University of Oregon, and here there were all these remarks about, well, she's Jewish, or and I just accepted them as people because that's the way I was raised, and that's what we did at home. And when I got to school and heard all these racial things, well, it was a shock to me, really.
But a lot of Scandinavians.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, there was a timber crew and there was a steel crew. What did the steel crew do?
They laid out the railroad, and it was interesting to watch. If you get down to that Collier Museum, well, then you see some of the relics of the steel crew, and that was pretty hard work too. And they had it down to a pretty good system. How first they grade the road bed, and then they come along and then grab the ties, lay them down, and then have this machine where they hoist the rail out, and then the crew come and with the sledgehammers and hammer the spikes in to attach the rail to the ties, and it was amazing watching them. How they laid out a lot of railroad in a day.
And pick it up too? Did they pick up another?
Yeah.
So there was one crew laying it out, and was there another crew picking up?
Well, what they were laying out was a railroad. It might be a spur or a line to a logging operation, and then that may be an operation for a year or so. But then when they moved to another loading site, and then they pick that up. And the number of the old railroad grades was later used for fire roads.
Right. Yeah. For the Forest Service.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of people in these camps. Did Shevlin-Hixon take pretty good care of them, or do you ever recall any labor disputes or anything, for example?
Yeah, there were some strikes, but it was more general overall strikes for the logging industry rather than specifically Shevlin-Hixon, I think. There were a few labor disputes, but not out of the ordinary. Because I think as a general rule, then people were happy.
Yeah. Well, And as you say, that's true. You know, there were general strikes in the timber industry. Some companies participated and some companies didn't. And I was wondering if Shevlin-Hixon, if you recall, whether Shevlin-Hixon, participated in those, or whether they generally stayed out.
Only thing I can remember, there was the International Woodworkers of America apparently were trying to unionize, and and they were called IWW. Well, I remember my dad making the remark that stood for I won't work.
Okay. And of course, the IWW is International Workers of the World.
Oh, it is?
They were the Wobblies.
Oh, okay.
And they were very socialistic and very radical. IWA was International Woodworkers of America, which came later. They were, but go ahead.
Yeah, I just remember IWW and my dad, saying that stood for I won't work. And
yeah. Okay. Well, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that. But a lot of companies would have taken that stance because the Wobblies were almost anarchists. Their primary stance was, as a laborer, what you need to remember is that labor and management had nothing in common. And they were radical. There were a lot of beatings and things like that. Of course, that was back in the early days, in the turn of the century, 1900, and up into 1920, and a little bit into the 1930s. IWW still exists up in Seattle, but they were an interesting group of people. But not that you can recall as far as.
I remember a few strikes, but I would consider that the logging industry.
What about school? Did Shevlin-Hixon provide facilities for school?
Most of them were transported by school bus, and Lapine was the major school area. I don't know if Lapine's got new schools, but at the time, Lapine was a pretty small area, but they had a large school, and it's primarily because of all the kids from Shevlin being transported there via school bus.
A lot of kids in the camps.
Yes, when we stopped at Mac and Pat's anniversary party, we were sitting across the table from these people from Happy Trails, and we got talking to this man, and his mother taught at Shevlin for 3 years, and that was the camp after the Timbers camp, apparently, because we got talking about the time and everything, and he spent time out there with his mother, and then his mother taught primary grades at Shevlin, and that was in the 30s.
Okay. But you mentioned the Timbers camp. I was thinking the Timbers camp was the last camp.
Timbers was the last camp.
Okay, well, it wasn't. It was the first. It was the second camp.
Okay, but the point is that there were schools out there in the camps then.
Yeah. They had some more of these houses that they fixed up for the primary kids.
In the early camps.
But the Finley Butte, and then I'm sure most of those were transported
went to Lapine. When they got closer to Lapine, they went to Lapine School.
Yeah, okay. But prior to that time, then, there apparently were schools in the camps, and the company, I assume, provided materials or whatever for it.
And housing, I think, for the teachers.
I don't remember any of the schools.
Because that was in the 20s and early 30s.
Okay, well, then having schools, there were obviously children out there. What were the things for the kids to do out in these logging railroad camps? I mean, you'd look at them and think, gee, these are the middle of nowhere. What did the kids do?
Well, they had, I remember little individual playgrounds in their backyard, and they did a lot of hunting and fishing and that kind of stuff. And
did they have bikes?
Well, remember there weren't any paved roads, so there might have been some bikes and everything, but everything was dirt paths and dirt roads, and so they didn't use it for a lot of transportation. They probably had fun on them,
Yeah, but I remember some bikes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there were bikes.
What about Things like movies. You ever have any movies out in the camp?
No, I don't remember any movies.
I don't.
Or a community hall?
Let's see. Is there I don't remember a community hall.
No.
Okay.
Of course, now keep in mind that a lot of the entertainment was a big night. They'd go to bed and go to a movie on Saturday night. And in those days, then that was fairly common for the week entertainment for the whole family. They'd go to bed and go to a movie.
I can remember the folks going out, and this was in the late 30s or 40s, going out to Lapine for dances with Bill and Alice there.
Yeah, Saturday night
There was a big dance.
they had a big dance, and a lot of people, and a lot of them got drunk too. They really hooped it up on Saturday night. I remember when I was this is 1944, I think it was. I was a lookout at Spring Butte, just north of the Summit Station, and I went into Lapine Saturday night to get food supply, and on my way back, my car broke down, and I hitched a ride into Summit Station, stayed at my Dad's cabin. It was Saturday night. Dad was in bed, and then trying to get a tow for my car or something. I went to the service station Sunday morning, and the guy at the service station, and of course he knew who I was, who my dad was, and I phoned up my dad to see if he could come and help me, and he says, "Oh, your dad doesn't need to come all the way out from Bend, and then I'll go and tow your car in." And then these people are still drunk from the big dance last night anyway. They wouldn't even care whether the service station was open or not. So he went out a few miles, and we towed my car in and got it fixed on the way. But, Saturday night was the big dance night, and a lot of them really hooped it up and got bombed, and then they slept in Sunday morning and
Ready to work Monday.
But Saturday night was the night to really hoop it up.
Well, speaking of Sunday, was there any place for religious worship out in the camp?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was Sunday.
Yeah. They had a couple cabins that they used. Maybe that was what you call their community center, but they would have some church services out there, and the ministers would, but it wouldn't be Sunday morning. It would be Sunday afternoon, because I think lots of the ministers would come from Bend or other places and put on a service in the afternoon.
Okay. You speak, Bob, about folks whooping it up on Saturday night and doing a little bit of tipping, bottle tipping and whatnot. Did they have alcohol or beer in the camp that you're aware of?
They had one of these big railroad cars was the saloon.
Okay, so they had a saloon, and there must have been, what was in the saloon?
Beer, I don't know, no hard liquor.
Yeah. Any entertainment things in there? Pool tables?
Yeah, there was a pool table.
Okay.
Yeah.
Slot machines?
There was a few illegal slot machines. I remember that. Yeah, there were 3 or 4 one-armed bandit slot machines in this pool room.
Yeah, I don't remember. I never got in there, apparently.
And I remember I went in there just a kid, and I played the slot machine, and then the bartender told me, "No, you're too young." But there were, and one of the few acts of, illegal acts I remember, other than the illegal slot machine, was one of the loggers there. Then apparently he put in a lot of money in the slot machines, and the slot machine wasn't paying back a bit. And anyway, this was quite a topic of conversation around Shevlin Camp for about a week, because somebody broke into that pool hall, took the slot machines, took it to the garbage dump, and took an axe to it and broke it up and got the money out. And I remember chatting with the bartender. He was pretty pissed off about that. He said, I'm pretty sure I know who did it too, you know. But you can kind of tell the vendetta against the slot machine after somebody poured probably half a week's wages into a one-armed bandit and it didn't pay off.
So there was a saloon and there was beer there, and there was
yeah.
obviously some entertainment, pool tables, slot machines, card playing, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And the company didn't mind that, apparently.
Apparently provided.
No, that was actually one of these cars was the saloon.
Okay. So, company's policy on alcohol was it was okay, just be sober tomorrow when you come to work.
Oh, it was standard procedure for most of these people to have one or two beers after work. They worked hard out there in the woods there, and that was their relaxation after they came in. They had an hour or so, particularly the bachelors, they had an hour or so after they came in from the woods before the supper. And that was the time to go to the saloon and have a beer or two. And the family men would go home and have a beer or a cocktail or something like that. That was pretty standard operation for most of them.
The town center, they would be railroad cars, and in the town center were the offices, the cookhouse, and I think they had one for kind of a first aid station type thing. And cookhouse and dining room things.
In the bunkhouses.
In the bunkhouses. And then there were a few of them that were residents, because that's what I remember the Bill Bear family living in. And they were on wheels yet. They were on the railroad. But in the town center cars were still on wheels, whereas the housing were the ones that were lifted off and skidded into place.
You mentioned Bill Bear a number of times. How do you spell his last name?
B-A-E-R.
Okay.
And his son, Bill Jr., still lives in Bend.
Okay.
And they lived out at camp in his early days. His wife, I know, was secretary of the Deschutes Pioneers for a while. Because when I paid my dues... No, this is young Bill Bear.
Oh, okay.
Bill Bear Sr.'s dead. But when I saw the signature there, I asked, how are you related to the Bear family? She said, well, my husband is Bill Bear Jr. So...
You got a phone ring.
Okay, well, let's you and I talk a minute here, Bob.
Okay.
Did you work out in the camps with your dad?
Yes.
Well, what was it that you did?
I was his compassman, primarily. When most of the time during the summer, when the weather was better, we were laying out truck roads for the logging operation. And I was running compass for him while he was laying out the road, so make sure that the roads and the grades were suitable for the logging operation to pick up the logging. And that was, they were getting more into the truck logging then and going away from the railroad logging.
With the spur lines?
Yeah.
Was it like truck to train?
Yeah,
okay.
right.
Okay.
But then they were hauling the trucks had longer hauls. Then, originally, when they did it almost exclusively by rail, well, then the cats would skid the logs right up to the railroad spur, and then they would load the logs directly on the railroad truck. That was originally when they had all those railroad spurs, but later on, then they would load them up, skid the logs and load them up onto the trucks, who then drove to the railroad siding where they loaded them up onto transferred them from the logging trucks onto the railroad trucks.
Was a lot of that occurring by the time the Finley Butte camp came about, or was it later than that?
I think it was mostly later than that.
Around Summit.
Yeah. I think most the stuff in Finley Butte was, it still had almost all railroad spurs. You go roaming around the woods in that Finley Butte area, where then you can still see evidence of the old railroad grades. But they got into the Summit Station, the timber camp, where they did more and more of the logging road.
Right, okay. Well, what about the wives of these timber workers in the camp? What did they do with their day?
Well, keeping a family going out there and doing the types of washing that they had to do. There weren't any automatic washers or dryers, and cooking and cleaning and everything that they had. There really wasn't. They were busy, and with the family. I know they had some social clubs, like quilting and things like that. But
was there any way for them to bring in a little extra money somehow, doing things around the camp?
I'm
I
not
know
aware of
that Lois was postmistress, I think, wasn't she?
Yeah, I'm not aware of.
Okay. They didn't take any wash of the bachelors and maybe do some of that too.
They may have. I know my dad had his lunches packed by one of the women out there, and he paid her for that.
Well,
when he did
that was earlier.
Yeah.
Later on, then you just take lunch from the mess.
Yeah.
Any waitresses in the cookhouse?
Yes, right.
Were these married women or single women?
Most of them were married. Yeah, most of them were married.
The wives of
wives of one of the loggers, and they had 2 or 3 of them working in the cookhouse as kind of waitresses. And they hustled too during those meals.
What about cooks? Always men or ever women?
There was a male cook. What was his name?
I don't know, but he was a big, powerful, well-respected man, but I can't remember his name.
But he had a son about my age that worked for Dad for a while.
Were there ever any female cooks?
I don't remember any female cooks, but I remember a male cook.
Yeah, okay. The cook must have been a pretty important member of the community, as you say, where they cooked a lot of food and it was good food. What would happen if the cook was a lousy cook?
And then they'd get rid of it because food was very important.
Yeah.
And it was they lost money on the cookhouse.
Sure.
Because they did not charge near as much money to the individual meal as what it cost them to produce that meal.
And everything was served family style.
Yeah.
Big plates
and
stuff put out.
The breakfast was just tremendous. Hot cakes and eggs and bacon and toast and all that kind of
potatoes.
Stuff. Yeah, potatoes.
Yeah, always potatoes for breakfast.
What about dinner?
Oh, you always had a meat dish, and potatoes and vegetables and a salad and fruit and lots to eat. And it was family style, as Maurine mentioned, and so you could eat as much as you want. And everybody really packed it away.
And they did a lot of baking. They did their own baking because they made huge pies and huge cakes.
Yeah, and donuts and things like that.
They fried donuts, and they were the cookhouse was busy all day getting food ready ahead of time.
But they did not serve a lunch. They picked up when they come in for breakfast, they picked up their sack lunches.
These were in a sack. How much food can you get in a sack?
Big sacks, because generally about 3 sandwiches, probably a boiled egg, an apple, and an orange, and some cookies.
And those huge cookies.
Yeah, and so it was twice as much normally. And these guys were big too, and you could tell they from...
Well, they were burning a lot of cows.
Yeah, right.
Have not mentioned, and that is the Shevlin-Hixon picnic.
That was coming, but go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Tell
Well,
you-
no, that's okay.
Tell me about the Shevlin-Hixon picnic.
Well, it was a big annual affair,
And when did they begin?
as far back as I can remember.
At Shevlin Park.
Well, yeah, at Shep, but I can remember one of them being out on the Deschutes, out near where they were logging.
Well, I remember the ones at Shevlin Park, and the highlight of the picnic was when they had a tug-of-war between the logging crew and the mill crew.
Competition.
Oh, yeah, right. And then they get the biggest and the toughest and the strongest guys, and a rope about this big around, and that was quite a deal for that tug-of-war between the logging and operation and the mill crew.
Well, Maurine, these ones that you remember out on the river, were those early?
Yeah,
In time?
yeah, because I can remember my mother putting a tent up to put the twins down for their nap. It was kind of an all-day type picnic.
And how did you get there?
Oh, in our we at that time we
Probably
the old Oakland 8 car, I think, 'cause that's the one we got in 1930. And
of course, before that, then we had
The
1924 Model T Ford.
yeah,
But did they ever use the train to haul people?
No.
They never did.
no, not that I can remember.
No, the train was used just for
For logging.
Just for the logging operation.
Okay. This must have been at Benham Fall?
Yeah, that
Oh, okay.
yeah. Okay. I can remember the first picnics I went to were there at Denham Falls.
And these were company sponsored.
Oh yeah, yeah. It was a food. Just tables piled up high with food and lots of beer. And there was always some of these fellows would get drunk and pass out. And I remember one time they even had a band. And it was either over the 4th of July or Labor Day. I don't remember, but it was in conjunction with the holiday.
Big turnout?
Oh, big turnout. Everybody from camp and everybody from the mills would come.
Was it open to townsfolk if they wanted to come?
I don't think so. No, it was Shevlin-Hixon picnic. It was the Shevlin-Hixon employees and their families, and it was a big thing of the summer.
What time do you suppose that was in terms of
Well,
history?
I can remember it in the. I can remember Mom putting the tent up for the twins, and they were real little. So you were born in 27, so this must have been
about
28 because they were still taking naps. And this was a tent that she had made, and she set it up so they would have shade and a private place to sleep.
Well, do you remember, just to shift here again, did things change at all out in the camps with the Depression, that you recall?
I can remember my dad being paid in warrants.
What were warrants?
They were IOUs. And so he kept working. The folks had a loan from the Shevlin-Hixon company for their house they built in Bend. And apparently they only had to pay interest or something during the Depression. There was some special arrangement because they didn't want the folks to lose their house.
This is your folks.
Yeah, my folks, at the house they built in Bend. And so they could only charge them interest or something during the Depression. But my dad kept working, and my mother she was a seamstress in hemstitching, and I know she did that for extra money.
Well, what about timber operations? Did they continue on during the
think
Depression?
so,
Or were things,
Dad kept working.
yeah, okay. So there wasn't a lot of movement away from the camps then at that time. Everybody kept working away, cutting trees and milling lumber, and there was no depression in the timber industry.
As far as I know, I think slowed down and but they didn't shut down.
Okay, so people didn't move on.
I don't know. I really, because I was too young. I was 6, 7, 8, 9 years old in that age.
What about the Second World War? How did that affect camp life?
Timber industry was going hog wild then, and there got to be a shortage, a manpower shortage.
Why was that?
Because so many of the, particularly the single loggers, well, then they got drafted and went in the Army. And so there was a manpower shortage, and that's when a lot of the Oklahoma and Arkansas people came up to work in the logging camps. Because I was, well, worked for either for the Forest Service or Shevlin-Hixon during that period of time, during most of World War II.
I was off the University of Oregon in fall of 41, so I was there when Pearl Harbor happened. So I was away from camp then.
Okay. War industries on the Pacific coast, Portland, San Francisco, Seattle, were pretty lucrative for workers at that time. Any movement from the camps to those
I think there was some, and they had a problem getting log truck drivers. They were paid so much per 1,000 board feet of logs or lumber they were hauling, and that was a wage or a salary or price fixed by the federal government as price stabilization. But then there was also a kind of questionable operation as to how many board feet were on that truck. And if they were looking for a log truck driver, well, then they would see one that they want, well, then they say, how many board feet you had there? And the truck drivers say, tell them how much, and he says, well, if you were working for Shevlin-Hixon or somebody else, you would have this many board feet, which is that much more, so they'd get paid more. See? And so manpower shortage was felt, and that was how they got some of the operations. It's a little dubious.
Okay. Anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, you were talking about going to war, and I was a student at the University of Oregon, and then when school was out that spring, I went to work for Kaiser Shipyard in Vancouver, Washington, as a draftsman. I was the first female draftsman that Kaiser Yards had, and I worked there a total of 2.5 years during the war. But when you said manpower, and then I went back, but yes, lives were changed drastically during World War.
Sure. Well, so there was a lot of demand for workers in the logging industry for Shevlin-Hixon. I was looking for a job at that time during the Second World War and approached Shevlin-Hixon. Probably a pretty good chance I'd get a job if I had experience.
That's right, yeah.
Okay. How about after the war? Was the industry still going pretty strong? So that
it seemed like it was pretty strong because that's when the home building boom was going and the demand for lumber was quite high. And so after the war, then I didn't see any decline with the timber operation. In fact, it might have been just the opposite. It might have been an increase.
You ever know a guy by the name of Paul Hosmer?
Oh, yes.
Who was Paul Hosmer?
He was the editor and photographer, Paul Hosmer Sr., for the Pine Echoes, which was the official newspaper for Shevlin-Hixon. And I was going to mention, I'm glad you brought that name, well then he would definitely be one of your, well I guess he's long gone dead, but if you could find some of his archives, he was a good photographer too. And if you can get a hold of some of his stuff and records, well then you will find probably some real interesting photographs and also old copies of the Pine Echoes.
Okay.
was in Bend, and he had a couple of sons, Paul Jr. and Jim Hogg. They were around my age, and we went to Oregon State together.
Okay. Turned on it. Well, how long did he work for Shevlin-Hixon?
Whenever I asked my dad how long he worked for Shevlin-Hixon, he'd say 41 years.
And did he make it sound like that was a long 41 years?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's right. Because he started with them in Minnesota, and then they transferred him out to Bend. And then in the early 50s, when Shevlin-Hixon sold out to Brooks Scannell, then he retired for 6 months or so, and then Brooks Scannell hired him as their his superintendent for the logging roads, because at that time Brooks Scannell was strictly got into the log truck operation and was completely away from any of the railroad operations. And most of the logging was in the sisters areas, and my dad laid out the logging road, most of the logging roads that ran from the sisters area into Brooks Camp.
Okay, so this was after the war then.
Right.
This was in the 50s.
Yeah, this was in the 50s.
Okay, and Brooks was completely out of railroad logging. Everything was being hauled by trucks. Okay, and they were hauling from sisters in the bins.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Had a term for it. It was Shevlin-Hixon Gray.
She hated that color.
She hated Shevlin-Hixon Gray.
Yeah, and my mother, she would flatly refuse to live at Shevlin Camp because everything was painted Shevlin-Hixon Gray.
Yeah.
And I remember my older brother Jim, the first year the summer he worked for Shevlin-Hixon, he got a job. First he went out on the steel crew, but he only lasted about 1 or 2 days there because that was too tough work, because Jim was pretty small and skinny at the time, and that was too tough for work. So what they did is they gave him a job as painting these. Shevlin-Hixon took care of painting the outside of all these homes. So Jim had the job that one summer going around and painting all
Every building was painted the same.
The same.
Shevlin-Hixon
And
Gray.
my mother just hated that.
Must have got a bargain on battleship gray paint.
I don't know, but it was that way all through the years. So.
I think it might have been because it didn't show the dirt.
Yeah.
Because those camp was very dusty, because there were no paved roads, and every time a car drives on it, was a big cloud of dust that come up there.
And maybe storms were.
Yeah, and maybe one of the reasons was it didn't show the dust. But everything was shoveling.
Bob bought a house in Salem, and it was painted gray, wasn't it?
This is a nice new house, eh?
Beautiful home.
Beautiful home, but it was gray, and my mother, the first time she saw it, was that she hated it because it was Shevlin gray. She wanted me to repaint it.
Well, let me ask you this one last question here, and when did people first hear about Shevlin-Hixon selling to Brooks Scannell? How did they respond to that?
I remember, I think, just graduated from college at Oregon State, and it made the headlines of the Portland Oregonian. And I was pretty shook up about it because it was something that was rumored for years and years. I could tell it was coming when I was working for Shevlin-Hixon during the summer, and at the Timbers camp, when I was running Compass for my dad, so then we had laying out logging roads for a timber purchase that went clear down to the Klamath Indian Reservation, which was already all logged off and clear cut. And you could just look, because all these for the last 20, 30 years, well then Shevlin-Hixon been moving south out of Bend all the time, say. You couldn't go any further south after they reached that Klamath Indian Reservation, because that reached from many, many miles clear down to the California border. And then you kind of saw that the handwriting on the wall was that Shevlin-Hixon was running out of trees, or they're going to have to reduce their operation tremendously. But see it coming.
Well, what about national forest land? So they could have continued logging on that.
Well, right. They took advantage of all the timber sales they could get from the sales of the national forest land.
I remember at one time there was a Forest Service employee that lived out of camp because my husband's a graduate forester from the University of Idaho, and it was a fellow that he had been in school with, and I remember Dad trying to introduce Don, and then they knew each other, So this was after I was married, was in 45, so this must have been the late 40s. There was a Forest Service employee that lived out at camp, and apparently he coordinated the logging of the Forest Service land.
Oh, yeah. I knew there was several Forest Service employees that lived at Shevlin Camp. One of the fraternity brothers of mine, who was a forestry major, worked for the Forest Service there, because one of the things that the Forest Service had to do was mark the trees, because most of the logging in that area was selective logging. And then the Forest Service would actually mark trees which to cut and which to leave.
And so a couple of them lived in.
Yeah, and so a couple of them lived right in the Shevlin camp.
Well, when Shevlin-Hixon decided to sell, did they make an announcement so that folks living in the camps or whatever would be able to kind of put their lives together with this?
I was away from home by that
It was,
time,
the announcement came pretty suddenly, and it made the headlines of the Portland Oregonian, I remember, and they closed operation, I think about the logging operation, 3 or 4 months later. And I remember my dad had one employee then at the time, one Draston, and he found another job. And my dad was a little unhappy because he still had loose ends to clear up.
Sure.
And some drafting and final maps and so on and so forth. And my dad was kind of hard-pressed to find somebody who would work for a month to clean up some of those loose ends. And that was kind of the end of the logging operation. I think it was about 3 or 4 months after Shevlin-Hixon made an announcement they sold out the Brooks County.
Were people upset about it? Or I mean, this was
I
a company.
My mother
that,
was upset.
Yeah, because Shevlin-Hixon seemed, very paternal toward the people
Yeah.
that worked toward them, and then all of a sudden they're closing the doors. Clint had mentioned that folks were upset because they felt like when you went to
Betrayed.
when you went to work for Shevlin-Hixon, you had a job for life.
Yeah.
Of course, nothing is forever, but
Wasn't initially when the thought of two merging, wasn't initially something that Shevlin-Hixon was buying out Brooks County rather than the other way around?
I don't remember.
I don't remember that, no, because what I was working, they're just finished a senior year for civil engineering in Oregon State. I was working in Salem, and the front page newspaper was Shevlin-Hixon sold out to Brooks County.
so that was the first you'd heard of it.
Yeah.
And at that, then my dad got offered a job as logging superintendent or something down in Arizona, and my mom and dad went down and looked at it, and Mother didn't want to live down there, and so they turned that down. And then Dad went to work as the road construction supervisor for Brooks Gammon, and of course he was getting older at that time, but he wasn't quite ready for retirement. So, but he worked for Brooks Gammon for several years before he did retire.
Let me ask you this too. It sounds like your dad did a lot of the layout for the railroad grades themselves. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Any idea whatever became of those maps?
No, I don't know. My sister Ruth had some, and there was some historian or something around Bend that I think we gave some to. My mother hung on to those pretty tight
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
We had a Forest Service man come and ask us about my dad's survey notes. There was something that he said it would save them thousands of dollars if they could find them, and we could never locate them.
My reason for asking was simply because in my work, in my thesis, what I would like to have an example of how the railroad grades expanded out from Bend, out into the woods or whatever,
now,
over a period of time.
Keep in mind, on the railroad grades, well, then Shevlin-Hixon would just run a line from what at the time was the Great Northern Railroad, which ran north and south through all that area, from Klamath Falls clear up to the Dells, that area. And Shevlin-Hixon had some sort of an agreement for using the Great Northern Railroad, and I forget exactly where they hooked up, but I think it was around Lapine area. From Lapine to Bend, within the logging train would use the Great Northern.
Right.
And Shevlin would build, that would be part of my dad's job, build the sidings into it and off of it, off the Great Northern, and then they leased, or apparently had the use of their lines for transporting their logs to Bend.
Now, one of the easiest jobs in the whole Shevlin-Hixon was at the railroad loading area was a guy that operated the steam locomotive, and he sit in his engine and they were loaded up a logging car, and then a flat car, and then they toot the horn, and then the engineer, he would put it in gear, and he'd move up fairly slowly, one car length, put the brakes on, and then he'd load that car up.
That was the whistle pump.
Yeah, and that's about all he had to do all day, and the rest of the time he was reading a book or newspaper. But that was probably one of the only really easy jobs in the whole logging operation, was the guy that ran that locomotive.
So it was hard work. Was it dangerous work? No, I mean just logging in general.
Oh yeah, it was dangerous. I remember seeing the picture of Dolly Bloomquist here and visiting her husband, who was the logging in charge of logging roads, and visiting him in the hospital when the bulldozer was knocking down some trees to clear this right-of-way for this logging road, and the tree in turn knocked down another tree, and he was running away, but the tree got him and injured him, and he ended up in the hospital for a couple of weeks.
Well, what were ways, for example, that guys might get hurt in the woods?
I remember timber falling was also a possibility, and I remember a fatal accident that happened there, and oddly enough it was the log truck driver who was their safety man. He was backing up a log truck, and there was somebody behind him, and the guy turned around and run, but the rear wheels of the log truck caught him on the heel, knocked him down, and the double tire just ran right over the top of him. And of course, now these log trucks were much larger than the log trucks that you see on the highway today.
Oh, they are.
Yeah, they had 10-foot wide beds for one thing, and the only legal size on the highways is 8-foot wide. And that's why all the logging roads, they didn't use highways. They used their own private roads because they used the 10-foot wide beds, which were wider. But this log truck driver backed up over the top of this guy, and then somebody yelled, "Hey, you just ran over that guy." He says, "Oh my God." So he put it in low gear, and he pulled forward again and ran over him again. I remember my dad describing that to him. And there was so much weight on him, he says that everybody wore Levi pants. He said that they just split the seams of the Levi. But he says they ran over him again, but he said it didn't bother. He didn't shoot up the second time. But, and other unusual things on the logging operation, at one time, they had these logging roads were quite wide, particularly the main ones. And they had a lot of logging trucks operating. They had the right-of-way from the standpoint they took the inside of the curve, and the empties took the outside of the curve. So if you were going to make a loaded log truck, if you were going to have it curve to the left, then you cut clear to the inside, and the empties would come back when then they were on the outside. So then they crisscrossed. But I remember it was in, 1946 or something, they changed that operation. They decided to have, stick to the right things, general highway use.
Well, when a fella got hurt out in the woods, or possibly even killed, were there places in the camps that they could take the individual for medical
I
assistance?
think it was pretty minimal.
They had a first aid station, and that was.
But they had a hospital, what they call Lumberman's Hospital, was right now in Bend,
Oh yeah.
right near the mill. And
Donovan was in charge.
Yeah, it was a regular hospital. Yeah. My dad was there for the operation, and from that standpoint, well, then it was pretty good medical service. But from your first aid standpoint, it was pretty primitive.
How did they get the fellas into town then from the woods? Did they?
I don't know. Did you say
whatever was handy and available? I think somebody drive them in.
Yeah.
Okay. So they were driven in some vehicle. They weren't brought in on a train or anything.
No. One thing that my dad, I remember, was very proud of, that was his job, and was the big trestle out at Shevlin Park, the railroad trestle. I don't know if that's still there or not. I think
no.
I think that's
it's long gone. You still see some evidence.
But that was a beautiful structure, and I can remember that. And Dad was very proud of that. That was one of his engineering jobs.
Now, when was it that your dad came to Bend to work for Shevlin?
1916.
1916.
Before World War I, because then he got drafted. He and Sid got drafted, his brother Sid, and they were ready to be shipped out from New York when they found out that they were working with lumber and trees and things, and they got sent then to back to the Northwest to secure spruce lumber for the infant Army Air Force.
Right, the Spruce Brigade.
Yeah, and they were part of the spruce. They were some of the original people securing spruce timber in Oregon and Washington.
Right. How about that?
Well,
what was your dad working for Shevlin at that time?
He was working before, and then he was in the Army till about 1918, I think, and then he went back to Shevlin.
Okay. Where was he working while he was with the Army?
They in Oregon and Washington getting the spruce